hi, Stan.
Yes, Dan.
It's been great being your son-in-law the last 35 years, and I sure appreciate you being open to the idea of your middle daughter and I being married.
Oh, yeah.
And throughout those decades, I have appreciated getting to know you and how you have tried to be a peacemaker, I guess, in different ways, in different situations.
We try. Yeah.
And maybe for those watching this film, just could you give a brief paragraph about who you are, your sort of your faith and
Okay.
background, just a very brief one.
Grew up as a Mennonite preacher's kid. Went to a Mennonite college and seminary, thinking I could solve my intellectual questions in seminary, and then deciding I'd better be a teacher, so I went on to Ohio State. And then we had a chance to go to Kansas City. And in Kansas City, I started taking courses toward a doctorate, but we lived on the boundary line between the white and the black communities. And that started involving us in interracial activities that changed direction. We saw the injustice and the discrimination, and I joined NAACP. White people were acceptable in NAACP and became active. And
Is this the early 50s?
late 50s.
The late 50s.
58, 59, 60, 61.
I see. Okay.
And got involved in some picketing of stores that wouldn't hire black employees, and maybe some marches and other things. So I decided, why would I want to pursue an academic career when there's so much to be done as a pastor in a situation like this?
Thank you. Now I understand that from time to time people have asked you to speak for their groups about peacemaking or what have you, given that you are a Mennonite pastor. And I understand you've prepared a bit of a small presentation to a group of folks here in Kansas for a retreat, retired folks. And you decided to maybe share a little bit about how you've encountered law enforcement in the courts over the years.
True enough, I thought of a couple incidents I could report. And then I started thinking of more and more, and I got a list of about maybe 8 or 9, 10. And so I started writing them down. And it started with in college when one of the professors was arrested for advising a student not to register for the draft. That
The
was
Korean War?
The Korean War.
Okay.
And it was also the time of the McCarthy years when people were suspicious of pacifists. And the students were interested, and the college hired a bus and let the students go up to Toledo to see the trial. And the thing that surprised me was that the FBI manufactured evidence and convicted our Professor Larry Guerra of advising a student to drop out of college, go spend time in a dangerous prison, apply for future jobs with a felony on his record. It didn't make sense. And Guerra said, counselors don't tell students what to do. We look at options. But the manufacture of evidence went on by the FBI, and they convicted him and sent him to prison along with the student. And that shook me up, not because peacemakers went to prison, but because the court would allow that kind of manipulation to happen.
So at times it sounds like maybe Lady Justice isn't as blind as we might be taught.
That's where I learned the lesson of that particular thing.
Now this was back in the late 40s, early 50s.
Yeah, right.
And maybe 4 years after that, you and your wife, my mother-in-law, Anita, moved to Chicago, I understand, so you could work on graduate school. And the FBI knocked on your door one day.
Right. I was in the bathroom, so I didn't answer the door. Anita did. She invited the person in, and he introduced himself as an FBI person who wanted to see me. And I finished up in the bathroom and came out, and he only had one question. He said, did I know if a student that I knew in college was sincere in applying for a conscientious objection classification. And I said, well, I'm certain he was. He's a genuine, sincere kind of person and grew up in the Mennonite church in Napanee, Indiana. And I wouldn't have any doubts about it. And that's all he wanted to know when he left. After he left, I realized that I had left a copy of the Constitution of the USSR on the table by his chair. And something I'd picked up a year ago when I visited the Russian embassy in New York City with some friends. And he and I had both done that. And then I began to think, why had he looked me up and asked me this question? He could have asked his roommate, he could have asked his pastor in Napanee, Indiana, or other people who knew him. He wasn't even in my class at college. So I began to wonder if I was being put on a list of people that the FBI was suspicious of. Got a little paranoid.
Sure. Thank you, Stan, for that story. I understand that soon afterwards you began as a pastor in a church in Kansas City.
Right.
And like you said earlier, you immediately realized some of the injustices between the white world that was privileged and the African American world that didn't have any power or resources. And through your peace work and some of your protesting and writing letters and being somewhat of a social activist, I guess, for peace to help these two cultures better understand each other, a group of peacemakers honored you one day. The B'nai B'rith gave you a gift.
Yeah, they honored me for interracial work, and they gave me a gold watch and made a little speech saying that I had, by my activities in the NAACP and other interracial work that other churches on our side of the Missouri-Kansas line weren't doing, that I deserved this honor. It's a little strange. There were black people suffering a lot more than white people were, or that I was, but I got that honor. But the strange thing about that, a short time after, when we sold our house in a white neighborhood, we had moved away from the boundary, and sold it to Henry Goodson, a black veteran, military veteran, that the mood changed. I had violated our neighborhood traditions and customs and religious beliefs. And and I realized this, and I realized I upset a lot of people. So I prepared a statement, and I thought I've got to go around and talk to the neighbors and say, this is what I've done and this is why I thought I had to do it. And I printed it on copies of paper so I could hand it to them in case they slammed a door in my face, then at least they'd have something they could read. It was not an easy job. I sort of gritted my teeth and said, I'll go knock on these doors and try to do it. Well, I did it. I think most of the reactions I got was kind of silence. They just kind of shocked that I would think of doing that in their neighborhood.
It was unheard of, I suppose.
That's right.
For a white person to sell to an African American.
Yeah. I used the father of one of the Boys Club members. He was black. He was a realtor, and he told me that black realtors were called realtists. And so I used a realtist, and he found a buyer and made the arrangements. So that caused an angry reaction in some phone calls at night, waking us up, cursing us, threatening our children on the way to school. And then one night we found a Klan hood hung on our doorknob. So we realized we had struck a nerve, that this was a hard thing. A little surprising, a couple years later, as we went back to see some friends we had on that block, didn't know quite how they felt about it, but they were kind of proud of themselves that they had accepted Henry Goodson, that he kept his property better than anybody else on the block, and things had worked out. Although it didn't change the racial boundaries. those stayed the same. Henry Goodson's house was a little black island in a white ocean.
Stan, thank you for that story. I understand that just not too long after this, the Vietnam War picked up, and as you began to understand more about how an individual's taxes that are paid go to a chunk of the military machinery, including war, that you decided to do something unusual that most people probably don't do when they fill out their taxes. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Well, after worrying a little bit what kind of danger we were putting ourselves in, we stopped paying the full amount of our taxes. We held back some part of the taxes we thought were going for war, and we paid the rest so we could support schools and health programs, and including veterans hospitals. And but then we sent a letter along to the IRS, sort of pouring out our heart about our beliefs and convictions that we were trying to follow Jesus. And to our surprise, although we got threatening letters, nothing happened except that they would take the money out of our bank account and they would notify us, this is what we're doing. It took maybe a couple years to go back and forth with the correspondence, so we had 2 years interest to pay and a penalty, and then the bank would also charge us a fee for having the IRS do a withdrawal. But then the next year, since we withheld part of the money, we didn't keep it ourselves. We sent it to MCC or other groups that are working against the war or helping war refugees, trying to repair the damage of war.
Different humanitarian groups.
Yeah. And since we sent it to those causes, and then after the government took the money that we had held back, then we counted that money as a donation to charitable causes. Since they took another chunk out of our bank account, we counted the original chunk as a charitable cause.
Sure.
Didn't lose. We paid fees, of course, and so we paid a little extra.
So this non-payment really was not a way to keep more money to yourself, because you gave it away anyway.
Oh yes.
But it was really an ethical crisis, so to speak, realizing that you didn't want your money to buy weapons of mass destruction.
Right, and we told the IRS in a letter that this money would probably do more for our relationships with other countries than the war would.
Sure.
Bold statement.
Thank you, Stan. I understand, another encounter with law enforcement occurred after you and your young family moved to Bluffton, Ohio, where you were also pastoring a Mennonite church. Now, I understand you grew up during and before World War II, so you experienced the gas rationing, and many people back then, before World War II and during the war, would hitchhike.
Right.
But in the 60s, maybe there was a different cultural expectation, and didn't you have a hitchhiking encounter once?
Right. And hitchhiking had changed. It was no longer considered safe, and but I remembered how people couldn't afford to travel unless they had a ride from somebody else. And so I saw a hitchhiker when I was coming out of Lima after a hospital visit, and he was standing on the ramp going up to the Interstate 25 that goes over to Bluffton. And it looked to me like sort of a college student, and I thought I'd pick him up. So I stopped and picked him up, then went on up the ramp onto the interstate. And as soon as I got on the interstate, the police car must have been hiding somewhere and watching this hitchhiker. Stopped me, pulled up behind me, and then he had most of the questions for the hitchhiker. He wanted to know what he was doing, where he was going, and so forth. Not much for me, except he gave me a ticket, which I thought, and he said it was for picking up a hitchhiker. I decided this must be a freedom of religion issue. A Christian can help somebody even though it might be against the law to do that. So I thought I'd go to court and say I thought this was a freedom of religion issue. And when I got to court, we were both before the judge, the policeman and I, and he started talking about the dangers of hitchhiking and to the drivers and how you might be helping criminals and so forth. And he had good points. But then the actual charge was improper stopping on a roadway, which surprised me. When it was my turn to speak, I told the judge that I was a preacher and I preached on the Good Samaritan story, and I thought I should practice what I preached and so forth. And he listened to my story and said, okay. He dismissed the charges. And so I got off. I didn't get a chance to talk to the policeman afterwards. I would have liked to.
Thank you, Stan. I understand that your family then moved back to Newton, Kansas, where you started an administrative job as a sort of a peace and justice person for the Mennonites. And in that process, you learned about some of the Mennonite denomination's peace stance on Vietnam and the war. And in fact, one of your brothers and friends were volunteering and serving in Vietnam, but they had to leave. The United States forced them to get out because of the war. And you discovered that there was an option to maybe help victims of the war in North Vietnam, but you had to do it in a roundabout way.
Right. There was a lot of sympathy for the victims of the bombing we were doing. It was an immense amount of bombs were dropped on North Vietnam. And maybe it wasn't carpet bombing, but it was something similar with a lot of defoliants and other kinds of things. And we thought we could send aid to those groups who were helping war victims, the hospitals in North Vietnam. So people sent in money for that purpose, and we didn't know quite what to do with it. We didn't have a channel to send it anywhere, and that would get to those medical programs. So we finally found a peace group in Canada, and we sent it to them and got around the law. We didn't publicize what we were doing. I guess we were frightened that we could be prosecuted.
Maybe aiding and abetting the enemy, but you were
That's
like
right.
the Doctors Without Borders, trying to serve the medical needs of both North and South Vietnamese.
That's the way we felt.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, and hoped it would work.
Well, back in 1968, it was a tough year for the United States. And Dr. King, of course, was assassinated, and Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and there were sit-ins and protests on many campuses. Muhammad Ali refused to go join the draft.
The year before.
That's right. That's right. And this is a time when you moved back to Bluffton, Ohio, again to be a pastor and work with the town. And someone in Bluffton, I believe a Bluffton student, was organizing local farm workers because they were under some very difficult conditions. Some Latinas, and their families working on these farms in these Mennonite communities, but living in shacks and having no services whatsoever. And I believe you got involved with that some.
Right.
And
Yeah, that was a hot issue. And when I mentioned the migrants in a prayer, I discovered that just doing that is a problem for some people in the congregation. A lot of the members who were Mennonites claimed they were very kind to their migrant workers, and maybe they were. I'm sure that some of them were. But of course they wanted a decent wage, and this is the only way to get it was to form a union. And my members didn't expect the pastor to be pro-union, or some of them didn't. Yeah.
I understand that also during this time at this small congregation, a Mennonite who had gone to the Vietnam War showed up one day, a Jack Kibble.
Jack Kibley came back from Vietnam. He had PTSD, but he was struggling. He didn't have a very good reputation because his family ran the liquor store. His mother was still coming to church, but he never darkened the door of the church. And but he did something that agitated everybody in the community, it seemed. He hung an American flag in the window of his trailer home, and then he sewed a peace symbol on the flag. And that upset some people very much, and they charged him with defacing the American flag and took him to court. I went to his trial, and sure enough, they convicted him, and the judge gave him 4 months in jail and fined him $400.
Mm.
It seemed unfair. I went to the judge afterwards. I didn't know how this was done, how you operate in a courtroom, but the judge was willing to talk to me. So I talked to him in his office and said this seemed to be unfair for a war veteran who had risked his life and lived in danger in Vietnam to have this kind of a judgment. And he agreed, but he couldn't drop it. He did cut it in half. He cut the time in half down to 2 months and the fine to $200. So I was glad to find the judge was that agreeable.
Sure.
I don't think he liked the law in the first place.
Now I understand that in this same town, small town in Ohio, Bluffton, they would have parades like every small town, but your peace group decided to try to have a peace float.
Right.
And you were worried, I think, at that time that there might be trouble because of this peace float, so you contacted the sheriff. Is that right?
Right. We had worked trying to think of a float that wouldn't attack anybody's beliefs exactly. We just weren't going to protest the Vietnam War. We were just going to have a banner on this farm wagon that said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and pull this in the parade. But we did hear rumors that there would be trouble, so I called the sheriff, and the sheriff didn't show up. This is different than Kansas City, where I was afraid to call the police because I was afraid they were too sympathetic with the community. But this time I thought maybe the sheriff would want to avoid trouble, but he didn't show up. But during the parade then, a carload drove in front of our float and blocked us, interrupting the parade. And they piled out of the car, and angry voices demanded what did we think we were doing. So we just said we thought we were trying to follow Jesus and promote a peaceful way. And when we mentioned Jesus, they weren't really prepared to talk about that, and the mood sort of changed. And after a few more comments, which I don't recall, they got back in the car and drove away.
No harm.
No harm. It just.
Good job de-escalating that one, Stan.
We were scared. We hid our fear as best we could and tried to be calm.
I understand during the Vietnam War era there in Bluffton, a friend of yours, the founder of Habitat for Humanity, Millard Fuller, came to town to speak for Easter service.
Right.
But he didn't come alone, did he?
No, on the way to our town, he picked up a hitchhiker who was a soldier. And he found out that the soldier was AWOL in a sense. He had walked away from his army base. He had filed to say that I'm a CO and I can't be in the army any longer. But the officers wouldn't believe him and put him in jail. And he sat in jail for week after week after week, and finally he saw a chance to get out, and he walked away and started hitchhiking, and Millard Fuller picked him up, brought him to Bluffton, and he was speaking several nights. He said, well, one night can we have this draft, or this escapee from the army jail speak and tell his story? And I said, well, sure, that'd be great. And well, he did, and then I found out 2 members said, we're leaving the church. We're shocked that you would allow a felon to speak from our pulpit, an escapee. And I admitted I hadn't thought about that I was aiding an escapee from a jail. Later on, when we were in Jamaica doing MCC work, Millard Fuller came to Jamaica to promote Habitat, and they had a reception for him. And I got a chance to talk to him, and I said, do you remember coming to Bluffton and picking up a hitchhiker and having him? He said, oh yes. I said, what happened? He said, well, I talked him into going back to the army camp. And he did that, and he served his time. And later on, he married, and he's doing well.
I see. Wonderful closure.
Yeah.
I understand that your last contact with the Federal Bureau of Investigation was when you participated with a fellowship group, not the Fellowship of the Ring, but the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a group that decided that a group of peacemakers could help the peace process with the Vietnam War if they went to Paris during the peace talks and actually spoke with, I think, the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, the South Vietnamese, and the U.S. delegation,
Right.
but separately because they were at war with each other.
Right.
Can you tell a little bit about why the FBI got concerned about that?
Well, we didn't think that the reports we were getting about the Vietnam War were accurate, and we found out later that was true. And we thought if we went to to Paris, to the peace talks, and talked to the participants directly, we might get a different story. And we did. So we went there. But when we came back, the FBI was waiting for us, and they were there with cameras taking pictures of each of us. And then as we went through customs, the customs officials went through everybody's luggage and confiscated the notes we had taken or the papers we had picked up. Luckily, I had been a little ahead of the group and got to customs before some others, and I got through without having my luggage searched.
They didn't realize you were part of the fellowship.
They didn't realize I was part of that delegation to the Paris Peace Talks. So, but they do have my picture. If they have a file on me, maybe that's in there.
The FBI?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what they've got.
I understand, Stan, that in more recent history here, you actually were in New York trying to peacefully engage folks at the United Nations, but you landed in jail, but somehow you got some ice cream out of this. What happened there?
We had this huge demonstration. I would think 300,000 or 400,000 people gathered in March of 2003, hoping to show that going to war in Iraq was a mistake. It didn't do anything. It wasn't reported in the news. The New York Times didn't have any pictures or any articles about it. They were just ignored. Some pastors thought, maybe 100 pastors, clergy, rabbis, priests, Catholic priests, nuns, if we gathered on the steps of the U.S. delegation to the UN and asked to talk to the U.S. delegation, maybe we could make a mark. I think we knew ahead of time they wouldn't talk to us, but we gathered there anyway and asked if we could talk to them. They didn't see us, and we just stayed there waiting, hoping that they might open the door and talk to us. Finally, the police were called and we were hauled off to jail. In our group, some nun pastors, Daniel Ellsberg and his son, and Ben Cohen with Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream. And Ben Cohen was quite interested in talking to me about Mennonites, so we talked for a while in the jail. We were in a large room, and at the end he said, well, here's my card, and on it is a statement saying you get a free ice cream. So I took it, and later on we used it.
Maybe there'd be less wars if we had more ice cream.
Yeah, I tried to get him to come to Newton to speak at some college events or things. I had no luck.
Okay, he's a busy man.
And he's quite active yet in social causes.
Sure.
Yeah.
In closing here, I'm recalling a family story that I think brings some credence to that your family and you have walked this walk. I mean, sometimes I think the secular world has critiqued the Mennonites in their pacifist stance, and with critiques that if we were really affected with violence, that we would use violence. Now, I understand that your family did not choose the violent path in response to your sister, our Aunt Helen's, vicious rape and murder back in the 60s. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's a story that says something about your integrity and your character.
When that happened, I think the family was stunned and afraid. They changed their locks on the door. They put up motion detector lights, and they did They watched cars. Some of them maybe bought dogs that didn't have them before. We weren't so much angry, I think, as just in grief, didn't know how this could happen and what a tragedy it was for her family, her daughters growing up without her mother, and her husband losing his wife, and all of us, of course, losing this precious person. But later on, we found out that when people were working against the death penalty, our story could be useful. We were against the death penalty. We never spoke on behalf of the murderer of my sister. We never found out who it was. But we did say that in our case, we thought that kind of pursuit would be harmful for us. We were focusing on healing and working out our grief, and wouldn't have wanted to go through all kinds of capital trials and appeals and that kind of thing that would have had to go through if they would have caught the person.
Sure.
So we tried to focus on healing, and just today I got an email from a person who's working on testimony for our state legislature, a committee hearing dealing with the death penalty. They're trying to get rid of the death penalty in Kansas. And we've had a committee working on that for several years, and I've been on that. Anyway, he wanted to use some things I'd written in a booklet about getting rid of the death penalty. So I gave him, says, yes, please use it. So
Wonderful.
maybe they'll use it. And that's a legal thing to do, to work through the legislature.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope it stays that way, but if the way the Muslim migration things playing out, we may have to provide sanctuary in a way that may not fit all the laws. So we may still have to be prepared to have an uneasy relationship with law enforcement.
A just resistance with an ethical, theological maybe basis.
Right.
When human beings are suffering, we all suffer.
Right. Well said.
Yeah. I understand that some of your nieces, Aunt Helen's daughters, had been leaders as adults in some of these efforts to educate states and governments about the insanity of the death penalty, and they've had great success where some states have actually outlawed the death penalty,
Yeah.
and that they've also managed to personally speak to murderers in prisons and explain the value of forgiveness, and that's been a powerful message for people.
Well, it definitely has, and I admire the way they've given time. I know Betsy, one of the daughters, came to Kansas and spoke at various places against the death penalty and helped a lot of people. It's quite a contribution she made, taking that amount of time to come from Vermont to Kansas and other states to do that.
Stan, we're going to close now, and I don't know if there's anything else you want to close with, but unfortunately, human history, I think, teaches us that depravity is tenacious, and regardless of our age and our society, it kind of follows us. And
Right.
we find ourselves today, I think, in somewhat of a crisis. How do we reach out to our neighbors who maybe are feeling persecuted, our undocumented neighbors, our Muslim neighbors, our neighbors from different countries that are being persecuted right now?
Yeah, our church has been meeting about that and what steps we're going to take, and we have to be prepared, I think, to weigh living our Christian faith, and which may be against the law in some of the immigration rules, in providing sanctuary for people. I guess these questions keep coming up, even though we think that we're past it.
The silver lining, I think, in some of these societal crises is that people like you and others come to the surface and actually, with love, serve their neighbors, even though it's against the law. And I just want to say thank you for your service, and you're willing to engage our law enforcement and our jails and even getting some ice cream for it, but
Yeah.
speaking out and speaking up and walking with those who are persecuted.
Yeah, we don't suffer as much as those we try to help, but at least we do what we can.
Thank you, Stan.
Yeah.